Welcome to our lecture where we'll be covering eCTD Module 5, Clinical Study Reports and Datasets. Module 5 is arguably the most critical module in the entire eCTD submission because it contains all of the clinical evidence that supports your drug's safety and efficacy claims. This is what FDA reviewers will spend the most time examining. Today we'll explore the structure, content requirements, and organization of Module 5, including the critical integrated summaries of safety and efficacy that are required for NDA submissions. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify where different types of clinical studies belong within the Module 5 structure and understand the relationship between Module 5 and Module 2 clinical documents. Here's our roadmap for today's lecture. We have 8 main topics to cover. First, we'll start with a high-level overview of Module 5 and its role in the CTD structure. Then we'll dive into the detailed table of contents to understand the granularity of organization required. We'll examine the M4E guideline which governs the CTD efficacy section, and importantly, we'll compare Module 5 with Module 2 to understand how they work together. The heart of our lecture will focus on the 5.3 clinical study report sections. This is where the bulk of your clinical data resides. We'll do a deep dive into the structure of individual clinical study reports following ICHE 3. Finally, we'll cover the integrated summary of safety and integrated summary of efficacy. These are critical documents required by FDA regulations that synthesize all your clinical safety and efficacy data. Let's begin with where Module 5 fits in the overall CTD pyramid structure. This pyramid represents the common technical document structure that we've been building throughout this course. At the top, you have Module 1, which is region-specific administrative information. Below that is Module 2, containing your overviews and summaries, the executive summary of your entire submission. The base of the pyramid consists of Modules 3, 4, and 5 quality, non-clinical, and clinical respectively. These contain all the detailed data that supports the summaries in Module 2. Notice that Module 5, clinical, is highlighted here. This module is unique for several reasons. First, it contains all clinical study reports from human studies conducted during drug development. Every Phase 1, 2, and 3 study report goes here. Second, it houses the ISS and ISE in their entirety. These are large integrated analyses required by FDA. Third, unlike Modules 3 and 4 where much of the work comes from contract laboratories or CROs, Module 5 typically involves significant sponsor involvement in the preparation of clinical study reports. The sponsor's medical and regulatory teams are heavily involved in interpreting and presenting the clinical data. Let me elaborate on these 3 key characteristics of Module 5. First, Module 5 serves as the central repository for all clinical study reports. This means every human study conducted during drug development, from your first-in-human Phase 1 dose escalation studies all the way through your pivotal Phase 3 efficacy trials, all of these complete study reports are housed here. This also includes any supportive studies, pharmacokinetic studies, and even studies in indications you're not seeking approval for if they provide relevant safety data. Second, the integrated summaries are critical documents. The ISS, or Integrated Summary of Safety, pools safety data across all your clinical studies to provide a comprehensive picture of your drug's safety profile. The ISE, or Integrated Summary of Efficacy, does the same for efficacy data. These are specifically required by FDA regulations under 21 CFR 314.50 for NDAs. Third, the level of sponsor involvement distinguishes Module 5 from the other technical modules. In Module 3, you often receive manufacturing and quality reports from contract manufacturers. In Module 4, toxicology studies are typically conducted by contract research organizations. But clinical study reports require extensive interpretation of data, and the sponsor's medical and regulatory teams are intimately involved in this process. The key distinction to remember: Module 5 is your primary clinical evidence base. This is what demonstrates that your drug is safe and effective for its intended use. Now let's look at the detailed table of contents for Module 5. This structure comes from ICH-M4E, the CTD Efficacy Guideline, and the Comprehensive Table of Contents Headings document. Section 5.2 contains a tabular listing of all clinical studies. This is essentially your clinical study index, a table that lists every clinical study with key information like study number, design, patient population, and status. Section 5.3 is where all the clinical study reports reside, organized by study type. Section 5.3.1 covers biopharmaceutical studies. These are studies evaluating the physical and chemical properties of your drug as they relate to bioavailability. This includes bioavailability studies, comparative BA and bioequivalence studies, in vitro-in vivo correlations, and reports on bioanalytical methods. Section 5.3.2 contains studies using human biomaterials for pharmacokinetic purposes, things like plasma protein binding studies and hepatic metabolism studies using human liver microsomes. On the right side, Section 5.3.3 covers human PK studies, your clinical pharmacokinetic studies in healthy volunteers and patients. This is organized by intrinsic factors like age, gender, and organ impairment, and extrinsic factors like food effects and drug interactions. Section 5.3.4 is for human PD studies, pharmacodynamic studies. Important note here, this section does not include your pivotal efficacy studies. Those go in 5.3.5. Section 5.3.4 is for mechanistic PD studies, biomarker studies, and proof-of-concept work. This comparison is crucial for understanding how the eCTD works as an integrated document. Module 2, specifically Section 2.5 Clinical Overview, is designed to be a relatively short document, typically around 30 pages. It uses graphs and concise tables to present the key findings. It's meant to give reviewers a quick, high-level understanding of your clinical program. Importantly, Module 2 is not supposed to repeat detailed information. Instead, it cross-references the detailed presentations in Module 5. When a reviewer wants to drill down into the specifics of a particular study or analysis, they follow the hyperlinks to Module 5. Module 5, in contrast, contains the comprehensive, full clinical study reports with all the detailed data, tables, and patient listings. This is where reviewers go to verify the claims made in Module 2. Think of it this way, Module 2 is your executive summary that tells the story. Module 5 is your evidence vault that proves the story is true. The M4E guideline explicitly states that material presented fully in Module 5 should not be repeated in the clinical overview. This is why proper cross-referencing and hyperlinking between modules is so important in eCTD submissions. Let me show you a real-world example of how clinical efficacy data appears in Module 5. This is from the Inbrija NDA levodopa inhalation powder approved for Parkinson's disease off episodes. This was a Phase 3, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study with 351 patients randomized and treated for 12 weeks. The primary endpoint was change in UPDRS Part 3 motor score at 30 minutes post-dose. Look at the results. At 30 minutes, Inbrija showed a 9.83-point improvement compared to 5.91 for placebo, a highly statistically significant difference with p less than 0.001. This benefit was maintained at 60 minutes. The patient-rated outcome, whether patients felt they were on at 30 minutes, showed 58% for Inbrija versus 36% for placebo, again highly significant. This type of controlled clinical study supporting the claimed indication would be placed in Section 5.3.5.1, Controlled Clinical Studies Pertinent to the Claimed Indication. This is where your pivotal efficacy trials go. Notice how the data is presented, clear tables with treatment groups, statistical comparisons, and p-values. This format follows ICHE3 guidelines for clinical study reports, which we'll discuss in more detail. ICHE3 is the guideline that standardizes the structure and content of clinical study reports. This is one of the most important ICH guidelines for regulatory affairs professionals to know. The objective of E3 is to allow compilation of a single core clinical study report that is acceptable to all regulatory authorities in ICH regions, FDA, EMA, PMDA, and Health Canada. This harmonization saves enormous resources by eliminating the need to prepare different report formats for different agencies. The CSR structure mirrors the format you see in non-clinical study reports from Module 4, providing consistency across the technical modules. The E3 structure includes 16 main sections: title page, synopsis, table of contents, abbreviations, ethics documentation, investigator information, introduction, study objectives, the investigational plan which describes study design and methodology, and then sections 10 through 15 cover the results including patient disposition, efficacy, safety, and conclusions. Section 16 is critical, the appendices. This is where you include the study protocol, sample case report forms, the list of IRBs and ethics committees, investigator CVs, patient data listings, and the statistical analysis outputs. The appendices often make up the bulk of the CSR volume. The integrated summary of safety and integrated summary of efficacy are critical components of FDA submissions. These are specifically required by Regulation 21 CFR 314.50 for NDAs. The ISS, governed by Section 314.50 D, 5, 6a, must provide an integrated summary of all available safety information. This includes not just clinical data but also pertinent animal data, demonstrated and potential adverse effects, clinically significant drug interactions, and any other safety considerations. The ISE, under Section 314.50 D, 5v, must demonstrate substantial evidence of effectiveness for the claimed indications. It needs to support your dosage recommendations with data broken down by gender, age, and racial subgroups. These are large documents, often hundreds of pages, that pool and analyze data across your entire clinical development program. The ISS looks at safety signals across all studies. The ISE synthesizes efficacy data to build the case for approval. While ISS and ISE are regulatory requirements for NDAs, FDA also encourages sponsors to provide these analyses for BLA submissions even though they're not formally required by regulation for biologics. This is because the integrated approach provides valuable context for reviewers. Let's test your understanding with this matching exercise. Each study type has a specific location in the Module 5 structure. A bioavailability study comparing tablet versus capsule formulations goes in 5.3.1.2, comparative BA and bioequivalence studies. In vitro protein binding studies using human plasma go in 5.3.2.1, plasma protein binding studies. Remember, 5.3.2 is for studies using human biomaterials. Drug-drug interaction studies, like evaluating the effect of a CYP3A4 inhibitor, go in 5.3.3.4 extrinsic factor PK studies. A thorough QD study for cardiac safety assessment goes in 5.3.4 human PD studies. Even though it's a safety study, the QD study is measuring a pharmacodynamic effect. Your pivotal Phase 3 efficacy trial goes in 5.3.5.1 controlled clinical studies pertinent to the claimed indication. Long-term safety extension studies go in 5.3.5.3 reports of analyses of data from more than one study, which is also where your ISS resides. Post-marketing commitment studies go in 5.3.6 reports of post-marketing experience. Published literature that supports your submission goes in 5.4 literature references. The key principle: each study type has a designated location in the eCTD structure, and this organization is consistent across all ICH regions. This is what makes global submissions possible. Thank you for your attendance.